Темная ночь, только пули свистят по степи, только ветер гудит в проводах, тускло звезды мерцают.
Chapter 3, A Russian in Algiers. Shelves in the local shops of Algiers were covered with dust. The Germans, it seemed, had cleaned up everything. Not soldiers, you understand, a merchant explained apologetically. They were businessmen in civilian clothes. They sent everything to Libya, to Rommel. Afterwards, when the Allies came, the Americans, we hoped that business would change. We still hope. But, and then the conclusion, accompanied by the appropriate shoulder shrug, what can you do? It's the war. Ronnie Stead, the Monitor correspondent in Algiers since the invasion, told me how once, immediately after a bombing, he saw an old French couple literally walk out of the ruins of their house after a bomb had crashed into it and dismiss their terrifying experience with a shrug and the inevitable remark. It ran so utterly true to form that Ronnie felt amused despite the tragedy. As in so many wartime cities, the one touch of color relieving the drabness and shoddiness of unpainted houses, dirty streets, and ungarnished show windows was the infinite variety of uniforms. There were spahis with scarlet cloaks and jangling spurs. There were admirals festooned with gold braid. While I was having a haircut one morning, into the coiffeur's walked a young captain of the Foreign Legion. He was as ornate as a Christmas tree, with his ribbons, his medals, and sundry little silver baubles, a miniature cutlass, some sort of bird, some tiny crossed pistols dangling from the pocket of his beautifully tailored tunic. There was a glance, neither to the right nor to the left, aloofness in his manner that let you know he was distinctly someone above the run. He easily and effortlessly established his priority over the cringing civilians awaiting their tonsorial turn, and with perfect timing advanced on a chair that happened to be vacated at that moment. A veteran of Bir Hachaim, one of Koenig's men, my barber explained in an awed whisper. I mentally compared this gorgeous creature with the disheveled, battle-stained members of the Bir Hachaim garrison whom I had seen in Libya just after their heroic stand. Yes, the French had come a long way since then. By comparison, the Americans were much less dressy, but there were far more of them, and they were everywhere. In the broad thoroughfares of the European city and in the narrow alleys of the Arab quarter, their light khaki drill was sprinkled through the swirl of burnouses in nondescript European garb. And the amount of saluting you had to do, wherever you went, definitely took the joy out of being a war correspondent in uniform. In this respect, it was quite unlike the good old days in Cairo, where despite the perpetual military parade, there was almost no saluting. That was because there were Australians around who said they'd be damned if they'd salute a blankety-blank Englishman, even if he happened to be a B. de Brigadier. But though the American GIs might salute their French allies, they never spoke to or fraternized with them. It wasn't only the language barrier. They just weren't interested. Though they were physically in Algiers, most of these American boys were mentally thousands of miles away. When they thought of the French at all, it was with vague irritation or, at best, condescension. Even an officer said to me, "These frogs are all right in their own way, I suppose. Only it isn't our way. They're different. More like children, spoiled children, and that's how you've got to treat them. Humor them sometimes, scold them at others." Few of the official Americans had a kind word for General de Gaulle. The press room, several floors up in a large modern building, was like a college classroom during a charwoman's strike. There were row upon row of little desks, a portable typewriter on each. Maps, bulletin boards, and posted announcements cluttered the walls haphazard. Here every evening at a set time, some 200 accredited correspondents foregathered to hear the communique on the day's operations in Italy. They listened breathlessly to the words of the military spokesman, scribbling notes the while. Then and there they pounced simultaneously on their waiting typewriters. And for the next hour or so, a staccato pandemonium broke loose, in the course of which the skeleton communique was clothed in reams of copy and in 200 unique styles. For most of the correspondents, this was the whole story. They were utterly wrapped up in the military news and, with a few outstanding exceptions, totally ignorant of or indifferent to the French political scene. Yet a great nation was being reborn under their very noses. Here in the sole section of metropolitan France, free from the Nazi yoke, for Algeria, though in Africa, is legally an integral part of France. The mold of France's political future was being cast. At the time of my visit, delegates from the French underground were meeting in Algiers. These men who had smuggled themselves past the Gestapo to voice the will of the French people provided a graphic preview of liberated France, the utter repudiation of Ch03 and other rightist elements, and the overwhelming endorsement of de Gaulle and a swing to the left. The members of the French Committee of National Liberation were bubbling with indignation at having been left out of the Moscow conference. The local French press was brimming with passionate prose on the subject, reminiscent in its temperature of the hotter sessions of the Chamber of Deputies back in Paris. This, regardless of the issues involved, was a healthy sign that Frenchmen were indeed pulling out of the slough of apathy and defeatism and regaining their old Gallic spunk and temperament. They also resented the indifference and condescension of the Americans. It stung their pride more sharply than outright hostility could possibly have done. The British, by comparison, were far more considerate of French feelings and tried not to give offense. The daily American newspaper, Stars and Stripes, was strictly a house organ for the AEF. And though it came out with an Algiers dateline, it never so much as mentioned the momentous meeting of the delegates of the French underground. But its British counterpart, the Union Jack, reported on the meeting at some length. Consequently, in Algiers, there was a gradual rise in British stock, inversely commensurate to the steady decline in American popularity. A year before, when the Americans headed the North African landings, they had stood ace-high with the French. Hence, they encountered a minimum of resistance, whereas the British, had they been in the forefront, would doubtless have met determined opposition. The anti-British poison skillfully injected into France's fevered brain after Dunkirk was still working. Furthermore, the French had not yet forgiven the British attack on the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir. Ever since the Allies set foot on North African soil, the British had been watching their step. They kept their skirts carefully clear throughout the maladroit attempt to foist General Henri Giraud on the French liberation movement in place of General de Gaulle. They also took pains not to irritate the French unnecessarily in small matters. In Franco-American disputes, they assumed the role of mediators, seeking to reconcile the Americans to the French viewpoint. And despite the fact that lingering French rancor was fanned from time to time by mistrust of British motives in Syria, a portion of the French suspected the British of secretly encouraging the Syrian and Lebanese demands for complete independence. Franco-British relations had begun to improve. By making amends for past mistakes and washing away the bad blood between the French and English, Churchill sought to pave the way for a renewal of that close alliance that had long been a keystone of British policy. The British and Americans no longer had the diplomatic field in Algiers to themselves. A third power had appeared on the scene and was throwing its mighty weight around, quite gently for a start. In Algiers, I hastened to call on Alexander Bogomolov, the newly arrived Soviet representative. For 3 hours, we sat in his room in Algiers' swank Hotel Aleti, now an army billet for colonels or better, but looking about as seedy and run down as the rest of the town. Part of its facade, damaged in an early German air raid, was still boarded over. In the low candle power light, we munched tropical fruit that had been presented to Bogomolov that afternoon and discussed the international situation. Also present was a young fellow with the build of a football tackle, whom Bogomolov once or twice addressed as Misha. Throughout our conversation, Misha lounged on the couch and said nothing, though he listened intently to every word. Bogomolov was convinced that the Western powers would find it economically profitable to maintain good relations with the Soviet Union and to forge a strong post-war collective security system. It was the economic base, he said, that determined policy and outlook. Take the Orthodox Church in Russia, continued Bogomolov. His name in literal translation means pray God, suggesting that he had had highly devout ancestors somewhere along the line. In the old days, as the established state church, its economic base had been the czarist system. The revolution cut its economic roots out from under it. So for years it was against the Soviet system. But now the Soviet government has made terms with the church and provided it with another economic base, albeit a more modest one. So now the Orthodox Church had a stake in the Soviet system and would work for it. That was the whole secret, he added confidently. But how about the Marxist assertion that religion is the opium of the people? I objected. Oh, that, answered Mr. Pragod deprecatingly, is a matter for individual opinion. Our Soviet Constitution stands for freedom of conscience, you know? Bogomolov, perfect diplomat, was careful to say nothing to me that might be construed as criticism of the Allies. After all, North Africa was their theater. But he hinted that the fighting French, all too weary of their weakness and dependency on the big powers, did not enjoy being constantly reminded of the fact. And the patronizing attitude of many of the Americans was constantly rubbing salt into their wounded pride. You know what French pride is, Bogomolov remarked. At present, it's about all they've got left. No wonder they're a bit hypersensitive. The Russian was frankly disturbed by the presence in Algiers scot-free of a number of ex-Cagolards and other gentlemen who in peacetime France had taken no pains to conceal their fascist sympathies. Bogomolov hoped that the Allies would come to realize that halfway measures were not enough to rid the world of the fascist and Nazi menace. If any sort of stable peace was to follow this war, a clean sweep must be made. That was why Bogomolov and his government were also perturbed by the political setup in the portions of southern Italy then under AMG control, which none of them had been allowed to visit as yet. There was something mildly professorial about Bogomolov's spectacled oval countenance and his soft-spoken, concise delivery. It suggested the scholar rather than the man of action. His fund of background knowledge was encyclopedic, and his logic, in his own Marxian terms of reference, unassailable. Alexander Bogomolov was a comparatively young man. Unlike Maxim Litvinov, Ivan Maysky, and other Soviet diplomats of the older generation, Bogomolov had not known Lenin or Trotsky. He had no pre-revolutionary political past to make or mar him. He had matured under the regime. His career in the Soviet Foreign Service had been brilliant. In 1932, he was appointed Soviet ambassador to China, holding that post through the critical years of Japanese expansion into Manchuria and Inner Mongolia. Bogomolov had successfully weathered the purge of 1937-38 that had wrought such havoc among his colleagues, and in 1939 he succeeded Potemkin as Soviet ambassador to France. After the French capitulation of June 1940, he followed the Rump regime to Vichy. That was during the period of Soviet neutrality, but on June 26, 1941, the fourth day of the German attack on the Eastern Front, the Pétain government, without much argument, yielded to Hitler's pressure and severed diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Bogomolov was next appointed Soviet ambassador to the European governments in exile, with headquarters in London. There he formed many valuable personal contacts. He was especially cordial with Dr. Eduard Benz, head of the Czech government. Under his tutelage, Czech-Soviet relations soon recovered from the setback of the now-defunct Soviet-German pact, and the old cordiality was restored. In Vichy, Bogomolov had never cultivated the personal intimacy and confidence of aged, rabidly anti-Soviet Marshal Pétain. But in London he was soon on the friendliest footing with another French officer of monarchist and Catholic antecedents, General Charles de Gaulle. The fighting French leader, smarting from the snubs he received with such regularity from his British patrons and their American allies, responded swiftly to the overtures of Bogomolov, who alone of the representatives of the three major Allied powers treated him with full equality as the representative of a first-class sovereign power. In cementing these good relations with de Gaulle and the fighting French, Bogomolov was by no means acting solely on his own initiative. With characteristic judgment and foresight, the Russian government early recognized that de Gaulle, whatever his political antecedents, had become the voice and leader of conquered but undefeated France. Regardless of what London or Washington might think of this irascible and not always tactful soldier, the Russians recognized that he was all things to all Frenchmen whose spirit had not been blighted by the Nazi caterpillars. They perceived that his courage and pride were those of France, his voice that of France. The very foibles which his critics sought to magnify and exploit, his touchiness and addiction to histrionics, were French foibles. In the early days of the North African campaign, when de Gaulle was getting kicked around a bit by the American and British governments, the Russians kept carefully out of it. The Darlan Péruton Giraud tragicomedy had no repercussions on relations between the Russians and the fighting French. The Russians were not even present. But as soon as de Gaulle's ascendancy had been vindicated and the former Vichyites ousted, the Soviet government promptly recognized the French National Liberation Committee in Algiers as the representative of the state interests of the French Republic and as the leader of all French patriots fighting against the Hitlerite tyranny, a far more sweeping recognition than was ever bestowed by either Britain or America. The Russians complained that Bogomolov's arrival in Algiers to take up his duties had been deliberately held up for a considerable period by Allied red tape. The French believed this story. In any event, with his coming, a direct link was established between the Soviet government and the French Committee of National Liberation. Relations between the Russians and the fighting French, already good, became even better. The strengthening of the Soviet influence in Algiers had tangible repercussions. Already at the time of my visit, stringent measures were being taken to smoke out former Vichyites and other suspect elements, and to bring traitors to justice. A few weeks later, the Russian delegation to the Inter-Allied Mediterranean Commission arrived, 50 strong, headed by rapier-minded Deputy Foreign Commissar Andrei Vyshinsky. Perhaps Vyshinsky, who was state prosecutor during the famous Soviet treason trials, gave the French a few helpful suggestions on how to run their purge. At any rate, thereafter it gathered momentum, to the grim satisfaction of French patriots everywhere. And General de Gaulle's popularity, though showing no increase in Washington and London, soared to new heights among his fellow countrymen. The Russian policy of closer ties with the French has been aided by the military situation. For a long time, the Red Army was the sole army fighting the main bulk of the Wehrmacht on the European continent. And during the months when there was no second front, Soviet propaganda, as well as the French communist underground, exploited that fact to the utmost. In the night of oppression, the only light of hope seemed to come from the East. Even the Allied air war redounded to Russia's favor, for it was inevitable that in raids directed against Nazi military objectives in France, such as the Renault automobile works outside Paris, French civilians should also suffer. The same applied to the bitterness that sometimes addled French joy at being liberated by the Allied armies after the invasion of France. For war is a nasty business regardless of the purpose, and a lot of French towns were knocked to pieces and a lot of Frenchmen killed in the process of being liberated. By contrast, no French civilians were killed, no French houses hit by the Russians. To the French, the Red Army offensive was a war against Laboche, pure and simple. The Russians, for their part, always gave full credit to the activities of the French resistance movement. And after the Allied landings in France, they approved and supported the fighting French demands for more of a part in the military operations. From the outset, relations between the Soviets and the Free French were helped by the fact that the Free French saw a distinct advantage for themselves in closer contacts with Moscow. To this end, they sent a picked group of French fighter pilots to the Soviet Union in the autumn of 1942. These were the members of the Normandy Squadron, which has made a name for itself in Russia, flying with the Red Air Force through every major campaign of the last 2 years. Improved contact with Moscow aided the fighting French in many directions. It enabled General de Gaulle to some extent to follow a stronger line in his dealings with Britain and America. An occasional hint was enough to frighten the Western powers with the prospect that the Free French, if not handled gently, would gravitate into Russia's orbit, which would be especially upsetting to Churchill's dream for a post-war renewal and strengthening of the Anglo-French alliance as the cornerstone of British continental policy. The object which recently took General Charles de Gaulle to Moscow was much the same as the motive behind President Raymond Poincaré's visit to St. Petersburg in 1914. Then as now, France and Russia were drawn together by the common threat of Prussian militarism. Today, the French look to the Soviet Union as the one great continental power with the means and the will to keep Germany in check and prevent a new German comeback. The Russians realize that they can rely on France to back them on their policy of a stern peace for Germany. The seeds of the Franco-Soviet pact, which de Gaulle signed in Moscow, were being sedulously tended by Bogomolov at the time of my Algiers visit.